In this first video on industry evolution, we will discuss the industry life cycle and provide an overview of how industries change over time. Note that the product life cycle, which you've probably been familiar with from marketing, is similar to this, but it's driven by different factors, so it's important to pay attention to what drives industry change. On this graph, you'll notice that there are two key lines here. The red line represents industry capacity, which is basically a combination of the number of players in the industry and their capacity in terms of how much product and services they can produce. The black line represents consumer demand, whether it's B2C or B2B. Now, on this graph, you can see there are 5 stages of the life cycle. We first start with the introduction or the beginning of a new industry. This is, again, a rare phenomenon because we don't often see many new industries starting from scratch. We often see additions or changes to an industry. In the introduction of a new industry, there is a new product or service that is introduced, and you'll notice demand exceeds supply or capacity because consumers see the product and want it, but there is only one or very few suppliers who are able to produce it. However, over time, we enter the growth phase where we start to see capacity ramp up, but we also see demand ramping up at a faster pace. It is during this time that consumer preferences begin to become cemented and a dominant design of the product or service begins to take shape. In addition, at this time, because demand is greater than capacity, pricing tends to be pretty high, and we do not see very many price wars, but we do see a lot of entry into the industry representing the increase in capacity. And this ties into the Porter's 5 forces, where during the growth phase, we tend to see a fairly high threat of new entrants and a fairly low power of buyers because this demand exceeds supply. However, you'll see at some point too many firms have entered the industry and or something has shifted the demand to reduce the demand for the product or service. It could be both elements or one or the other. But what ends up happening is once you get the capacity exceeding demand, we now start to see things like price wars and firms struggling and going bankrupt. And here is where the smaller firms or the weaker firms either go bankrupt and leave the industry or they're acquired by the stronger firms. And this is where we start to see some of the more stronger companies with dominant designs take leadership. Then we have the maturity phase, which is where capacity and demand are relatively equal. It is here where profitability starts to stabilize and you start to also see the industry separate into strategic groups that stay over time. And so while this maturity phase on this graph looks pretty small, this is actually typically the largest section of the industry life cycle. And here is where competition tends to take on more of a routine or stabilized form. And we have firms that are focusing on particular customer segments, and the idea of a differentiation advantage or a cost advantage really starts to take hold and stabilize and stay this way over some portion of time. This is also where, for certain industries, you tend to see oligopolies emerge. And so the industry structure tends to become a bit more focused on a smaller number of firms in many industries. And in terms of Porter's 5 forces, this is also where you start to see entry barriers rise. And some of the entry barriers because of the fact that we are right at the stage where demand and capacity are equal. Moving on to the decline phase, here is where we start to see changes in the industry and something causes a decline in customer demand, whether that's a new innovation in a different industry or whether it's a change in customer preferences or something changes customer demand. And as a result, the demand falls, but the capacity falls at a slower rate. And we end up again in a situation similar to the shakeout where we have overcapacity. And during this decline phase, again, you will see firms leaving the industry, and this is usually fairly rapid, and firms will also be incurring losses. And here's where, again, the stronger firms will survive, but the weaker firms will tend to either fade out of existence or be bought out. Now, what's important to note is I'm presenting this here as a single life cycle. However, over time, what happens is you see several life cycles pieced together. So a series of life cycles. So an industry goes through a growth phase, a shakeout, a maturity. It declines a little bit, maybe because of recession or something. And then it starts to kick up again into another growth phase because something happens either in the economic or the consumer preferences which cause the demand to grow again. And so very rarely do you see industries completely disappear, but rather they go through cycles of growth and decline. One more note here, it's important to point out that as I've been mentioning, the factors or the Porter's five forces tends to change at each stage. And so it's keep that in mind as we think about what stage an industry is in and what is likely to happen to those five forces. Now we want to spend a minute or two thinking about what drives the industry along this cycle. There are two main factors that drive industry change. The first is just growth and demand. And this could be due to growing customer base, changing customer preferences, increases in discretionary income or increases in corporate income. So something is driving a increased demand for products or services. That's a demand side shift. On the supply side, we often see innovations where new creations or new knowledge is created or shared, and we start to see dominant designs take shape. And so what ends up happening is we first tend to see a product innovation, which really drives industry growth initially, but then over time we start to see process innovations, which then add slight improvements to that product or service and continue to drive industry growth. And we often see, again, over an industry life cycle, a shift from a design emphasis, where we design the product to meet customer needs, to a production emphasis as we edge towards maturity, where efficiency becomes a little more important as capacity and demand equal out. So again, the key factors driving us through that life cycle are supply side in terms of innovation, and then demand side in terms of changes in customer demand due to some factors outside of the industry. And then finally, it's worth mentioning about competition and competitive strategies over the life cycle. As we progress through the life cycle, industry competition will change based on industry structure and the intensity of competition. That intensity of competition really comes about through where the supply curve is relative to the demand curve. And then key success factors will also change as the industry matures, and we think about innovation as an early key, but later on it becomes a question of scale and then a question of strategic positioning in terms of value versus cost. During this life cycle, organizations must adapt to survive, and this is where the dynamics of competition come into play. However, this is also where many organizations fail, because organizational change is very difficult and painful, and they often struggle with inertia. This is a topic we'll get to in a later video on industry evolution.